At my mother's wedding, she called me a disgrace for not toasting her new husband, so I revealed the affair that started while my father was dying. The priest actually walked out. I never planned to attend my mother's wedding to the man she'd been seeing behind my dying father's back. But when she publicly called me a disgrace for not toasting them, something inside me snapped. What happened next left 200 guests in shock and sent the priest walking out. The ballroom at the Drake Hotel in downtown Chicago buzzed with laughter, clinking glasses, and the soft melody from an overpriced live band. Everything about this wedding screamed money. White floral centerpieces that must have cost a fortune, golden candle holders catching the light just so, and linen napkins folded into perfect swans beside plates that probably cost more than my monthly student loan payment. I sat at a round table near the front, my wine glass half empty, my plate mostly untouched. The entire scene was polished, extravagant, ridiculous, and frankly, a slap in the face. My brother Nolan sat beside me, his fingers nervously adjusting his tie for the 100th time. "You okay?" he asked quietly. I exhaled through my nose. "Peachy." His gaze darted toward our mother, Victoria Caldwell, formerly Reynolds, the woman of the hour. She stood near the dance floor, radiant in her cream-colored designer gown, smiling like she hadn't burned our family to the ground. Her hand was clasped tightly around her new husband's waist. Mason. The man who had been in her life long before my father had passed. My grip on my glass tightened. I wasn't supposed to be here. I had no intention of coming when the invitation arrived on thick, elegant cardstock embossed in silver. I had thrown it directly into the trash without hesitation. Then Nolan called me. "Lily, please," he had begged over the phone, his voice breaking. "I know you hate her, I do too, but I can't do this alone." I sighed, pinching the bridge of my nose. "You really want to sit through Mom marrying him?" "No," he admitted. "But if I have to suffer through it, I want you there with me." And just like that, I was on a plane back to Chicago, sitting in a stiff chair at a wedding that should have never happened, watching my mother play happily ever after with the man who had helped destroy my family. The worst part? The guests were eating it up. To them, Victoria was a respected woman, a renowned pediatric surgeon, a devoted mother, a grieving widow who had found love again. Bull. Crap. They didn't know the truth. They didn't know that while my father, Jonathan Reynolds, was dying of pancreatic cancer, barely strong enough to lift his head off the pillow, my mother was sneaking around with Mason behind his back. And now, here we were. "Are you drinking that, or just staring at it?" Nolan muttered beside me. I blinked and realized my fingers were still curled around my wine glass. I took a slow sip, letting the burn settle in my throat. "Both," I replied dryly. He huffed out a quiet laugh, but his expression remained tense. "I don't know how you're keeping it together right now." "Who says I am?" I could feel my mother's gaze drifting toward me throughout the night. I knew she didn't want me here. I wasn't part of the perfect picture she was trying to paint. But Nolan had insisted, and she had begrudgingly extended an invitation, probably hoping I'd decline. She should have been so lucky. Then, just as I was considering ordering another drink, my mother did something that sealed her fate. She clinked her glass. A hush fell over the ballroom. Victoria cleared her throat, her face lighting up with that charming, practiced smile she always used in hospital fundraisers and country clubs. "First off, I want to thank everyone for being here tonight," she began. "This is a special day, not just for me, but for Mason. We are so blessed to have such incredible family and friends to celebrate this new chapter in our lives." Polite applause followed. I clenched my jaw. New chapter? Like the last one, my father's life, was a book she couldn't wait to slam shut. "Of course," she continued, her voice carrying across the ballroom. "I want to take a moment to acknowledge my children, Nolan and Lily." My stomach twisted. They've been through a lot this past year, and I know how difficult transitions can be. But Nolan, sweetheart, you've been such a strong, beautiful soul through it all. I couldn't be prouder of the man you've become. Nolan forced a tight-lipped smile, Then my mother turned to me. "And Lily," she said. I stared back at her, saying nothing. "I know we've had our differences," she continued, her voice smooth, rehearsed, "but family is family, and in the spirit of unity, I'd love for you to say a few words." My body went rigid. The room fell silent. I glanced at Nolan, who looked just as stunned as I felt. My mother smiled at me expectantly. This wasn't supposed to happen. I wasn't supposed to be here at all. When that invitation had arrived at my apartment in Boston, I remembered staring at it in disbelief. The heavy cardstock, the elegant silver script announcing Victoria Reynolds and Mason Parker's wedding celebration. I'd tossed it straight into the garbage, the same way my mother had tossed aside her marriage vows. I'd been living my life, building my career, trying to forget the nightmare of watching my father waste away while my mother grew more distant by the day. I thought I'd put it all behind me. Then Nolan's call came. I remember standing in my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, listening to my brother's desperate plea. "She's actually going through with it," he'd said, his voice hollow. "She's marrying him." "I'm not going," I'd replied immediately. "I can't sit there and pretend I'm happy for her." "I know," Nolan had sighed. "I don't want to go either, but if I don't show up, she'll never let me hear the end of it. You know how she is." I did know. Victoria Reynolds didn't accept defiance. She was a surgeon, after all. She was used to people following her orders without question. "Please, Lily," Nolan had begged. "I need someone in my corner." And that's why I was here. Not for her, for him. The guests around us had no idea what kind of woman they were celebrating. They didn't know about the late-night phone calls, the mysterious weekend conferences, the text messages I'd seen pop up on her phone while Dad was sleeping in his hospital bed. They didn't know about the night I'd found her crying in the kitchen, and how I'd thought she was finally breaking down over Dad's diagnosis. How I'd put my arms around her, trying to comfort her, only to hear her whisper, "I can't keep living like this." At the time, I thought she meant the stress of Dad's illness. It wasn't until later that I realized she'd been talking about her marriage. They didn't know about the afternoon I'd gone to pick up Dad's prescription and spotted my mother across the street, sitting at an outdoor cafe, her hand intertwined with Mason's. How she'd thrown her head back laughing, a sound I hadn't heard in our home for months. They didn't know how Dad had asked for her in his final hours, and how she'd arrived late, smelling of unfamiliar cologne. No, the guests saw what they wanted to see. A widow who had found love again after tragedy. A beautiful second chance. I took another sip of my wine, the memories burning worse than the alcohol. Beside me, Nolan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He'd been more forgiving than me. Or at least, he pretended to be. He still visited Mom's house for Sunday dinners. He still called her on holidays. He maintained the facade of a functional family. I'd cut her off almost completely after Dad's funeral. The last real conversation we'd had was 6 months ago when she'd called to tell me about the engagement. "I'm marrying Mason," she'd said, as if announcing she'd bought a new car. "Congratulations," I'd replied coldly. "I hope you'll be very happy." "Lily," she'd sighed, "it's been over a year. Your father would want me to move on." That was when I'd hung up, because she didn't get to speak for him. She didn't get to rewrite their story to ease her conscience. And now, here she was, calling me out in front of everyone, putting me on the spot. Classic Victoria Reynolds move. Back someone into a corner in public where they can't refuse without looking like the villain. "Lily?" My mother prompted again, her smile tightening at the edges. "Would you like to say a few words for Mason and me?" The room was silent, 200 pairs of eyes now trained on me. I felt Nolan's hand squeeze my knee under the table. A warning, a plea. I slowly stood up, smoothing down the navy blue dress I'd bought specifically for this occasion. Not too festive, not too somber. The perfect armor for a battlefield disguised as a celebration. "I wasn't prepared to speak tonight," I began, my voice steadier than I felt. My mother's smile widened with relief. She thought I was going to play along. "But since you've asked," I picked up my wineglass. "What can I say about my mother and Mason?" The crowd waited expectantly, a few encouraging smiles. The photographer moved closer, anticipating a touching moment. I took a deep breath. I could stand here and lie to all of you. I could toast to their happiness and pretend this is a beautiful love story. But I think we've had enough lies in this family. My mother's smile vanished. Mason straightened beside her, his hand tightening around her waist. "Lily," my mother hissed, but I was beyond stopping now. "Most of you know that my father died 14 months ago after battling pancreatic cancer. What you don't know is that while he was fighting for his life, while Nolan and I were taking turns sitting by his hospital bed, our mother was starting a relationship with Mason." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone dropped a glass. The priest, who had officiated the ceremony just hours earlier, looked up sharply from his dessert. "Lily, that's enough," my mother snapped, her voice carrying across the ballroom. "No, I don't think it is," I continued, my hands shaking now. "You called me up here. You called me a disgrace for not wanting to toast your relationship. So let me tell everyone exactly why I can't celebrate this union." I turned to address the guests directly. 3 days before my father died, I went to pick up his favorite book from home. He wanted to hear me read from it one last time. When I got there, I found my mother and Mason in our living room. They didn't hear me come in. They were too busy discussing their future together, how they would wait an appropriate amount of time before going public. The silence in the room was deafening. I could see shock, disbelief, and growing discomfort on the faces around me. "My father was still alive," I emphasized, my voice breaking slightly. "He was still fighting, and they were already planning their life together." "That's not what happened," Mason interjected, stepping forward. "You're twisting things." "Am I?" I challenged. "Should I mention the text messages I saw? The weekend conferences that mysteriously aligned with your business trips? The nights Mom came home smelling like your cologne while Dad was in hospice care?" My mother's face had drained of color. Several guests were now whispering among themselves. I spotted her colleague from the hospital, Dr. Winters, staring at her with undisguised shock. "You know what the worst part was?" I continued, unable to stop now that the dam had broken. "It wasn't finding out about the affair. It was watching you lie to Dad's face, watching you hold his hand and promise him you'd always honor his memory, all while you were planning your escape." "That's enough!" my mother shouted, her composure finally cracking. "You have no right! I have every right!" I shouted back, tears now streaming down my face. "He was my father! He deserved better than this. He deserved better than you." The priest stood up abruptly, napkin falling to the floor. He looked between my mother and me, then at Mason, his expression a mixture of disappointment and disgust. "I believe I've heard enough," he said quietly, gathering his things. "Mrs. Parker, Mr. Parker, I cannot in good conscience continue to bless this union." With that, he walked out, his footsteps echoing in the stunned silence. My mother was shaking with rage now, her perfectly applied makeup unable to hide the fury in her eyes. "How dare you?" she whispered. "How dare you ruin my wedding day?" "How dare you ruin our family?" I countered. Mason stepped forward, attempting damage control. "Everyone, please. This is clearly a family matter that's been blown out of proportion. Lily is still grieving, and grief can distort—" "Don't you dare!" I cut him off. "Don't you dare try to gaslight me in front of all these people. You were Dad's colleague, his friend. He trusted you." Several of my father's former co-workers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They hadn't known. Of course they hadn't. "You want a toast?" I raised my glass, my hand no longer shaking. "Here's to the truth finally coming out. Here's to my father, Jonathan Reynolds, who deserved a wife who honored her vows. And here's to you two, who deserve each other." I drained my glass and set it down with a sharp clink that seemed to echo through the silent ballroom. Nolan stood up beside me, his face pale but determined. He hadn't known I was going to do this, but he wasn't backing away. He placed his arm around my shoulders. "We're leaving," he announced, his voice quiet but firm. As we turned to walk out, I heard the murmurs begin to swell behind us. The perfect wedding was unraveling, thread by thread, truth by painful truth. My mother called after us, her voice cracking with rage and desperation. "If you walk out that door, don't you ever come back!" I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. For the first time in 14 months, I felt like I could breathe again. The night air hit my face like a slap as Nolan and I burst through the hotel's ornate doors. My heart hammered against my ribs, adrenaline still coursing through my veins. "Holy shit," Nolan breathed, loosening his tie with trembling fingers. "Holy shit, Lily." I couldn't speak yet. My throat felt raw, as if I'd been screaming for hours instead of speaking for minutes. Behind us, the doors opened again, and a stream of guests began to exit, their faces a mixture of shock, discomfort, and morbid fascination. No one looked at us directly. No one except, "Lily! Nolan, wait!" We turned to see our Aunt Claire, our father's sister, hurrying toward us. Her eyes were wide, her cheeks flushed. "I had no idea," she said, grabbing both our hands. "I swear to you, I had no idea. Your mother told everyone it started months after Jonathan passed." "Of course she did," I said bitterly. Claire pulled us both into a fierce hug. "Your father would have been proud of you tonight," she whispered. "Both of you." That was when the tears finally came, hot and fast, soaking into the shoulder of her dress. I hadn't cried like this since the day we buried Dad. "Let me drive you two home," Claire offered, fishing her keys from her purse. "I need a drink first," Nolan said. "A real one." 20 minutes later, we were huddled in a booth at O'Sullivan's, the dive bar where Dad used to take us for burgers when Mom was working late shifts. The familiar smell of beer and fried food was oddly comforting. "To Dad," Nolan said, raising his whiskey glass. "To Dad," Claire and I echoed. My phone hadn't stopped buzzing since we left the wedding. Texts from distant relatives, from my mother's friends, even from people I barely knew. I turned it off and shoved it deep into my purse. "Do you think I went too far?" I asked quietly, staring into my drink. Nolan snorted. "Are you kidding? That was the most badass thing I've ever seen." "Your mother made her choices," Claire said firmly. "She doesn't get to hide from the consequences." "She'll never forgive me," I said, realizing as I spoke that I didn't actually care. "Good," Nolan replied, "because I don't think I can ever forgive her." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the evening settling around us. "What happens now?" I asked. Claire squeezed my hand. "Now you live your life without the burden of their secrets. Both of you." My phone buzzed again in my purse. With a sigh, I pulled it out, expecting another text from someone at the wedding. Instead, it was an email notification. From Mason. Against my better judgment, I opened it. "Lily, what you did tonight was unforgivable. Your mother is devastated. I know you think you know everything about our relationship, but you don't. I loved your father too. He was my friend. Things are more complicated than you understand. Your mother and I will be leaving for our honeymoon tomorrow as planned. When we return, I hope you'll be willing to sit down and talk like adults instead of causing scenes." Mason. I handed the phone to Nolan, who read it with growing incredulity. "They're still going on their honeymoon?" he sputtered. "After that?" "Of course they are," I said, a strange calm settling over me. "They've never cared what anyone thinks. Why start now?" Claire read the email next, her lips pressed into a thin line. "He has some nerve," she muttered. I took my phone back, staring at Mason's words. A month ago, this email would have sent me spiraling into rage and grief. Now, I felt nothing but a profound sense of release. "You know what?" I said, deleting the email with a decisive tap. "I don't care anymore, I really don't." And I meant it. For 14 months, I'd carried the weight of their betrayal, the burden of their secrets. Tonight, I'd finally put it down. "I'm going back to Boston tomorrow," I announced. "I've said what I needed to say." Nolan nodded slowly. I think I might come visit you soon. Get out of Chicago for a while. You're both welcome any time, Claire added. Your father's family is still your family. For the first time in over a year, I felt something like peace. Not happiness, not yet, but the possibility of it somewhere on the horizon. 6 months later, I stood in my Boston apartment, staring at the envelope that had just arrived. The return address was my mother's, the first direct communication since the wedding. I'd heard snippets about her life through Nolan, who had maintained minimal contact, but she and I hadn't exchanged a single word. My phone rang. Nolan. Did you get one too? I asked without preamble. Yeah, he sighed. Haven't opened it yet. Same. We were silent for a moment, both contemplating the identical envelopes that had arrived on the same day, 3 states apart. On 3? He suggested. I slid my finger under the flap, tearing it open as Nolan counted down. Inside was a single sheet of heavy stationery, my mother's personal letterhead, not the joint one she'd started using with Mason. Dear Lily, I've written this letter a dozen times over the past 6 months. Each version seemed inadequate, which is perhaps fitting, as I've been inadequate in so many ways. Mason and I have separated. The divorce will be finalized next month. I gasped and heard Nolan do the same on the other end of the line. Are you seeing this? He asked. Keep reading, I replied, my eyes racing down the page. What you said at the wedding was painful to hear, but it was also true. I betrayed your father. I betrayed our family. At the time, I told myself I was simply seeking comfort during an impossible situation, but that was a lie I created to live with myself. The truth is uglier and simpler. I was selfish. I was afraid of being alone with my grief, afraid of a future without the certainty Jonathan always provided. Mason seemed like an escape route, and I took it without considering the devastation I was leaving in my wake. Our honeymoon was a disaster. Your words followed us everywhere. I couldn't look at Mason without seeing the hurt in your eyes, without hearing your voice saying your father deserved better. You were right. He did deserve better. You both did. I've started therapy. It's helping me face what I've done instead of running from it. I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not sure I deserve it. But I wanted you to know that your courage that night forced me to finally confront the truth about myself and my choices. I miss you. I miss your brother. I miss the family we were and the family we could have been if I'd made different choices. If you're ever ready to talk, I'm here. No expectations, no demands. Just a mother who is finally learning what it means to put her children first. With love and regret, Mom. I set the letter down, my hands shaking slightly. Through the phone, I could hear Nolan's uneven breathing. What are you thinking? He asked after a long silence. I don't know, I admitted. Part of me wants to believe her, but we've been here before, he finished. The apologies, the promises. I walked to my window, looking out at the Boston skyline as evening settled over the city. 6 months ago, I'd returned here feeling lighter, unburdened by secrets. Now I felt the weight of a choice. She's seeing a therapist, I said. That's new. And she left Mason, Nolan added. I honestly didn't think she'd ever admit she was wrong about that. Another silence stretched between us. Do you think Dad would want us to give her another chance? I finally asked, voicing the question that had been circling in my mind. Nolan was quiet for so long I thought we might have lost the connection. Dad always believed in second chances, he said eventually. Remember how he used to say everyone deserves the opportunity to be better tomorrow than they were today? I did remember. It was one of Dad's core beliefs, that people could change, could grow, if given the chance and the right support. I'm not ready to forgive her, I said. Not yet. Me neither, Nolan agreed. But maybe I'm ready to listen. That was the difference between us. Nolan had always been more willing to bend, to find middle ground. I'd always been more like our mother, stubborn, absolute in my convictions. The irony wasn't lost on me. What if we meet her together? I suggested. Neutral territory. Set some boundaries. I'd like that, Nolan said, relief evident in his voice. Maybe when I come visit next month? Okay, I agreed, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. I'll tell her. After we hung up, I sat down to compose my response. It took me 3 attempts to find the right words. Not too warm, not too cold. Just honest. Mom, I received your letter. Nolan and I have talked and we're willing to meet when he visits Boston next month. I can't promise forgiveness, but I can promise to listen. Dad always believed people could change. I want to believe that too. Lily. I sealed the envelope before I could second-guess myself. Tomorrow, I would mail it. Tomorrow, we would take the first tentative step toward whatever came next. Not reconciliation, not yet, but perhaps understanding. As I placed the letter on my counter, I felt something shift inside me. The anger that had been my constant companion since Dad's death wasn't gone, but it had softened around the edges, making room for something else. Not forgiveness, but the possibility of it. Not healing, but the beginning of the journey toward it. And for now, that was enough.